Sister Karine and I went to high school together. So this has been kind of a conspiracy for a long time that we've worked on many projects together. I grew up at Virginia Beach and graduated from college in Joseph College, Emmitsburg, Virginia Commonwealth University as a social worker. And I have done social work with pregnant and parenting teens and immigrants. And then the community asked me if I would get more involved in writing and community history. And I became the archivist for over 10 years. And then our provinces merged and there was an opportunity in Chicago. So I've been at DePaul University for since 2012. I am a Vincentian Scholar in Residence, and I teach a course on Elizabeth Seton in cyberspace, mind you. So I'm happy to share my thoughts on Elizabeth with you. She's a close friend of mine, and I met her as a kid in school when a biography came out, and I found out that her father called her Betty. She lived near the water, and she was Episcopalian. So all those things kind of fit in, and she had lost a parent at an early age, and I had lost my father when I was only 4. So Elizabeth Seton is very dear to me, and I was privileged to attend her canonization in 1975. The reflection sheet that you received is simply that. It's a reflection sheet for you after this session, if you would like to sit and reflect and think and pray with her. I would like to begin looking at her as a woman, an ordinary woman who lived an extraordinary life. And just like Jesus gave a framework for making choices and building strong Christian lives and family lives, so did Elizabeth Seton. She kind of lived into the promise that God gives us because there was a lot of emotional deprivation in her early years. She was born in New York just before the American Revolution, the second of 3 daughters. Then unfortunately, she lost her mother when she was about 2.5, when the mother was birthing the 3rd daughter named Kitty. The next year, a stepmother arrives unexpectedly in the Bailey household, and Elizabeth or Eliza and her sister were not happy campers. Within the first year of that second marriage, the infant baby died. In Elizabeth's earliest memory, she writes this, is sitting on the doorstep, looking up to the sky, looking at the clouds. When they said, "Why aren't you in here with your baby sister that was being waked?" And she said, "I'm looking for her and mommy up in the clouds. I want to go up there too." So sadness and grief was a thread in Elizabeth's life, her entire life. Her father gained fame as a physician, and I believe he was much more of a professional physician than a loving, present parent. For example, he went to Europe 3 different times to study in London, and each time took his 2 oldest daughters, Elizabeth and her sister Mary, sent them away to live with his brother and the brother's wife. Well, they enjoyed living there, and it was at New Rochelle where she discovered the wonder of beachcombing and looking at nature and bird's nest, etc. But she longed for her father, and she felt he didn't love her anymore. The second marriage really became a dysfunctional marriage. It was conflict-ridden from the beginning, yet 7 infants resulted, 7 babies from that second marriage. So Elizabeth was one of a blended family. Eventually, the father and the mother totally separated, and seems like he had a paramour on the side. While Elizabeth was living with her aunt and uncle, she did inherit what she called the Bailey temper, the impetuousness that ran in her father's family. But she also underwent what I would consider an adolescent depression. And in her journal, she acknowledges that she didn't do the horrid deed, which would have been to take laudanum, which is an opiate derivative that's used for colicky babies. She was able to say no, and today in our contemporary world where drugs and drug overdoses are so prominent, this is a point at which the students that I work with kind of say, oh, because they can identify with that. As her father finished his final advanced studies in London, he certainly became a recognized surgeon in the United States, a medical and anatomy lecturer at King's College, which became Columbia. And she began living went back, they lived in Lower Manhattan. She and her older sister lived with him because he had separated from the stepmother. She was still kind of melancholic, and we really don't know how she was educated, but she was educated. She was a highly literate woman, and she went to what seems to me to be a dame school, although we've never been able to really identify who Madame Pompélion was that she refers to. But what cured her melancholia was the social scene in Lower Manhattan and meeting tall, dark, and handsome and well-to-do William McGee Seton. When he was quitting her, he was musically inclined and he played the violin. He's supposed to have brought the first Stradivarius to the United States, and she loved to dance and play the piano. So music was something that really brought them together. But as she says in her later life, she was a mother first and foremost, and she would never make any decision or take on any obligation that wasn't in line with that responsibility. She also had an innate sensitivity of seeing the face of Christ in people who were poor. She was given to beneficence and became involved in charitable organization in New York. When she and her husband were married, she was only 19. She bore 5 children in 7 years, 3 girls and 2 boys. As a young mother, she was in a conundrum of how to handle the terrible twos of her oldest little girl, and she went about getting advice from different people and writing letters seeking what to do. And the father-in-law would say spanking, and somebody else would say, oh, kill her with kindness. And anyhow, she made her own decision and did not want to spank the child, and everybody survived. She was a founding member of the first society in the United States to be organized, managed, and run by women, the Society to Aid Poor Widows with Young Children. And that would be basically a social service organization doing home visits and providing concrete help and helping widows to get some type of employment, even in-home employment for sewing or mending or doing laundry. There was an excessive amount of widows in New York at the time because it was such a major port, and there were so many accidents on the sea where sailors or the crews drowned or were injured for life. Elizabeth was pregnant with her third child. Her stepfather had died, had fallen on ice in January. And incidentally, he had been the primary cashier of the First Bank of New York that Alexander Hamilton had set up. And the Hamiltons were not next door neighbors, but also lived on Wall Street, where Elizabeth and her husband first lived. So during her third pregnancy, it was a very difficult pregnancy. The delivery was difficult. The baby was not breathing at birth, and her father was there and helped resuscitate the child. So they named the child after her father, Richard Bailey. Excuse me. A few weeks before the birth, her father-in-law had died. The implications of that is that her husband was the oldest of another blended family of 13 children. So he was responsible for the care of his 6 younger siblings and responsible for the business. So she and her husband moved in to the Seton family home, took care of all those children, arranged for some to go to boarding school, et cetera, et cetera. But she was a woman with a big heart. That's what I would like to convey, despite the fact that she had just given birth and it had been such a difficult time. She was known to be a caregiver and caretaker for many people who were ill in her family or in the neighborhood or among friends. When she was living with these younger Seton children, her in-laws, rather than sending them out to school, she said it'd be much better, much easier for me if I kept them home. And she started homeschooling them. That's when she discovered she enjoyed teaching and she had a talent for teaching. That's an important concept to keep in mind. Because her husband was responsible for the business, he was not the experienced, astute manager that his father had been. At the same time, they were international mercantile firms, so they were importing and exporting. Crossing the Atlantic, there was an undeclared war with France. There was piracy on the high seas. The African nations wouldn't agree to stop the piracy. So shipments were being lost and bills were increasing. Her husband had the familial genetic weakness of tuberculosis, and he was not well. So at this time, Elizabeth was pregnant again. She was doing the books for him at night and doing everything she could to help her husband, to support him. And finally, they made the decision, which many people said was absolutely crazy, to take a sea voyage, which was considered in that day to be therapeutic. They distributed their children among family and took the oldest child that had had the temper tantrums with them. I think they didn't want her to stir up any trouble among the relatives. So they left to New York, and as they were preparing, the business was failing drastically. His business partner, went to debtor's prison. William McGee took advantage of the new law that was available called the bankruptcy law. So the business went bankrupt, and Elizabeth went through the humiliation of officials coming in and doing a detailed inventory of everything they owned, including the children's clothing. This is a woman who had been in the upper middle class and now could see the handwriting on the wall. But she was determined, and he was, that going to Italy, to Tuscany, would be therapeutic. And because her husband had had a continental education and done an apprenticeship in Tuscany with the Felici firm, he had friends there, good friends. So they went, they embarked, they took their 8-year-old daughter. They survived the trip. The Felici family was at the port to meet them. And just before they arrived, the officials in Tuscany had learned that there was a yellow fever epidemic in New York City. They saw this frail, sickly man and concluded that he probably had yellow fever. And to prevent the disease coming into the city, they insisted that they be quarantined. And we know a lot about quarantining nowadays, I know. But what they did, they put him in a rowboat and rowed out a couple of miles into the channel where there was a lazaretto after Lazarus. Big stone structure with a number of high steps, and they were locked in. No comfortable furnishings. The Felici family did what they could. They could not come to see them, but they eventually sent a domestic servant who was able to provide them food, etc. So they were there for 30 days on a cold, damp floor with Elizabeth trying to comfort her husband, and the little girl would just go off and play with the rag doll that someone had gave her. And then to get warm, you can picture big suitcases tied together with rope. She undid the ropes and started skipping rope. And so did Elizabeth to get warm, because there was no windows and the sea breezes were coming in. Elizabeth got very, very angry. She wrote long journal letters back to the Seton family, particularly her close friend, Rebecca, and she just poured out her anger at how could people treat a sick person in this way. So Elizabeth knew a lot of sorrow in her life, and this was just the beginning of her story in many ways. They were discharged. The Felici had gotten an apartment in Pisa, which is 15 miles inland, and it's a milder climate right on the Arno River. And they were there for barely 2 weeks. And although William McGee Seton wanted to go out and ride in the carriage, he was really too sick to do it and to enjoy it. It became a major deal. So 2 days after Christmas, with Elizabeth at his side, having been with him constantly, he died. Elizabeth Seton became a 29-year-old widow in a foreign country with 1 child with her, 4 more across the Atlantic Ocean. To my knowledge, she didn't speak Italian either. Fortunately, there was at least 1 and 2 of the Felici family that did speak English. Elizabeth could be called a patron saint of hospice workers or nurses because of her experience. Over time, she cared for and buried 2 daughters, 1 at age 16 and 1 at age 12, and 2 young sisters-in-law, age 19 or 21. Many of you may be parents. Elizabeth worried about 2 of her immature adolescent sons. So Elizabeth lived an ordinary life in an extraordinary way. And yet through that, she was a woman who had learned her basic prayers really through her stepmother. And Psalm 23 was something that was very special to her. She and her sister-in-law also were very devoted as communicants in the Episcopal Church and would go around on Communion Sunday to receive Holy Communion. There are three ways that I had suggested I would look at Elizabeth: as a woman, as a sage or a woman of faith and wisdom, and then lastly, as a saint. So, as a woman who was a mother, wife, widow, friend, woman of charity, she's really a woman of faith and wisdom. The scriptures she read regularly, not only for reading, but for prayer. And as she moved into her more mature years, she would write notations in the margins. And the Bible that she herself owned is at University of Notre Dame. One of her maxims that she wrote a list of, I think, speaks to the feminine side of her. Quote, "Take every day as a ring, which you must engrave, adorn, and embellish with your actions, to be offered up in the evening at the altar of God." Close quote. Most women can identify with wearing a ring. As a widow, Elizabeth eventually can be called a career woman, but as a widow, she knew financial distress, bankruptcy, and the struggles of relocating frequently for lower income housing. She encountered Roman Catholicism in Italy through the Felici family. That is a blessing or a gift that comes from in the midst of the misery and the sadness of that journey. The Felici were educated, very good Catholics, and in my opinion, the two Felici brothers could be considered the RCIA team. Elizabeth was not looking to convert, but while she was there and after her husband died, it was Christmas time, the Felici had relatives in Florence and they were planning anyway to go over to Florence. So they invited her to go with them, which she did. And of course, they put her up in nice quarters. They arranged carriage rides around to see the beauties of Florence. And the beauty in many of the European countries, particularly Italy, is in the churches. They didn't have the museums and they didn't have the Art Institute or University of Virginia, but the artwork was in the churches and they were devout Catholics. So that was Eliza's encounter with Catholicism initially. Excuse me. Initially, she began asking questions simply out of curiosity and for clarification. And as time went on, she began asking questions out of interest. Her questions focused around, why do you do this? What is it you're doing with your hand, the sign of the cross? And one time she was hearing Mass in a very famous Marian shrine, the Shrine of Montenero, overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea. I mean, it's just a gorgeous place. And she was praying in her own way, and she realized, she knew that the consecration was happening and that that was special. And this Englishman said rudely to her, that's what they call their real presence. And she was horrified. She was embarrassed for his rudeness and crudeness, and she bent down in deeper prayer and said to herself, my Lord and my God, they don't even recognize you. So her whole process of discernment and seeking what God was asking of her was a true process, like a spiral. And she went through a crisis of faith upon return because she returned to the United States with a Catholic heart. And in conversation with the older of the Faliki brothers, she'd asked a question, and he said, well, I don't know where people go who are not of our faith, but I do know what happens to people who do not respond to God's call when they're invited. And she said laughingly, so what are you saying? And he said, well, I'm simply asking you to search and explore and read and make a choice. And she just kind of laughed it off and said, well, if I'm not in the right place, God will direct me. Something to that effect. She quoted Alexander Pope. So she faced a choice and a decision. And when she came back to the States, she mentioned her interest in Catholicism while she was right there at the wharf. And the Setons were aghast because they were such strong Protestants, and Catholics were the objects of bigotry. But Elizabeth felt that the process of discernment would lead her to what God's plan was. And she really went through a heart-wrenching struggle for 6 to 8 months. But once she made her decision, she found inner peace. She had consulted with her Episcopalian director. The Faliki had put her in touch with Bishop John Carroll, whom she consulted. She consulted with priests in Boston, Father Jean Chevreuse and Francis Matignon. So she was getting good advice, but it was a major decision for her because she understood that she had to make a choice for herself, not just for herself, but whatever choice she made, it was going to involve her children and their salvation. She was looking for apostolic succession because she understood she was in the church that was not founded with a direct line to the apostles. And she was looking for truth, truth with a capital T, bold and underlined. After going back and forth and being in a state of high emotional distress, as I say, she finally put her foot down and said, damn it, I'm going to do it. But she said, to the Catholics I shall go and try to be a good one. She made her profession of faith in St. Peter's Church on Barclay Street in March of 1805. Now that is a church, if you're not familiar with it, that was very close to Ground Zero in the 9/11 attacks. And when Father Michael Judge, the chaplain of the fire brigade, was killed, the firemen took his body, carried it in, and laid it on the altar at St. Peter's. That's the same church. In about 6 weeks, she made her first communion on the Feast of the Annunciation. And the following year, Bishop John Carroll came to New York and she received the sacrament of confirmation. At that time, she took a confirmation name, Mary. And what she says about it or wrote about it in reflection, I have the name of the 3 great women of the moments of salvation: Mary, the mother of Jesus; Elizabeth, the mother of John; and Anne, the mother of Mary. So thereafter, her signature was MEAS. It does not mean Mother Elizabeth Ann Seton. It means Mary Elizabeth Ann Seton. As a woman of faith, she was sustained by the real presence Jesus in the Eucharist was like a magnet that drew her to Catholicism. Her prism of faith, as I see it, was really the Virgin Mary. And I say that because in the Fleeky home one day, she noticed there was a prayer book open on a, let's say, a side table by where Mrs. Fleeky sat. And she picked it up and looked at it. Now, I don't know whether it was in Italian or French or English, but it was the Memorare. And she read it, and she was very touched by it. She was so touched that she copied it down, not once, but 3 times. And at the end of one of the copies, she has, "Love me, my mother." That harkens back to the maternal deprivation that she felt in her early years as a child. And she even acknowledges that when she is writing to her sister-in-law about it. She felt like she'd found a mother. So as a Catholic, she continued to face not only poverty, but economic, religious prejudice and rejection from some friends and the Seton family. Although there were 3 women friends that really supported her and stayed with her the rest of her life. The first year when she returned, her brother-in-law, who was also a physician, and a Seton cousin, and her godmother supported her for a year. Well, her godmother was a wealthy Episcopalian who wrote her out of the will after the first year. She said, "Everybody wants me to get a job, but nobody wants to hire me. If they want me to maybe get a job in a china shop and sell teapots. But God knows, and when God is ready, I will know." Something of that nature. So she did get a job as a teacher. Was very happy about it. The school was about to start, and within 3 months, it had failed financially. So that was the end of that income and opportunity. One of her distant relatives had suggested that she be a house mother for boys who were boarding at an Episcopal school, and her children could live there. She wasn't thrilled about it, but she did it. And her own sons were bullied by the Episcopal kids because the Seton boys were Catholic. And there must have been some disciplinary issues. And the parents of the boys did not like how Mrs. Seton handled the matter with their darlings. So those parents took their children out, and she was left with not enough boarders to generate an income that would pay her expenses. So that did not work out. But as she said, when in God's time. And just at that time, she had a chance encounter with a priest who was traveling from Baltimore through New York to Boston. And it was none other than Father Louis Dubourg, who eventually became a bishop in the Louisiana area. Now, Bishop Dubourg, or Father Dubourg, was a wheeler dealer, but Elizabeth didn't know that. But he was one of these people that has great entrepreneurial ideas, and he gets a project going, and he gets people involved. And while it's still half-baked, he's turned on and gone to another project. But in the opportunity that they had to talk together, it was at a Catholic family's house in New York, and I guess they were invited for dinner. And Dubourg turned to her and said, "Well, Mrs. Seton, tell me about your situation. And she began to tell her story. And he said, "Oh, I'd love to have a school for girls." And she says, "I'll come and beg." Well, she claims and afterwards in writing that she was just saying it in jest, but he was dead serious. He saw the potential for a school marm. So she was invited by Father Dubourg and the Sulpicians of Baltimore. The Sulpicians were French emigre priests from the French Revolution. So in June of 1808, her boys were already down going to school at Georgetown College, which means a boarding school, not the university, although it's the university in its infancy. Somebody was paying for them. She packed the girls up and they got on a steamer and came down to Baltimore and arrived at Packer Street. Now, the significance of that location is it's the first Catholic seminary in the United States. And St. Mary's College, which became St. Mary's University in Baltimore, is the first Catholic university. Not only did Dubourg have an idea of a school, they had a house that had recently been built. So she had this lovely, small, she calls it French style home, which you can visit and tour. And the idea was to start small and have about 10 girls to be boarders. And she was a school marm. She would borrow seminarians for specialties, maybe language, or they came and tutored her in mathematics, I know that. She loved being so close to the seminary and the chapel, which was being dedicated the moment she arrived. That was by divine providence. She was extremely happy. They had some girls that were enrolled, including the family or children of the O'Conway family of Philadelphia. And the idea or the desire to live a consecrated life in community in an apostolic society began to kind of grow within her, with probably a little help from the Sulpicians, because Dubourg had wanted the Ursulines for 10 years, but he could never get them. And if a priest had started a school and could get somebody to start a little community and get that organized, then he automatically had faculty for the school, which means stability. So this is what was brewing. And Elizabeth was totally open to it, but she said, "I won't make any commitments that interfere with my role as natural mother to my children." And they suggested the model of the Daughters of Charity of France, founded by Vincent de Paul and Louise de Marillac in the 17th century, because they were the first community in France that could work out on the streets and was not cloistered. So the Sulpicians went into operation to do what they needed to do to make this happen. In the meantime, a seminarian was there at Baltimore, and he was a retired sea captain from Philadelphia, and he had money. He had to divest himself of his bank account before he went on for tonsure. And he offered to buy land to get the school started. The only catch is Bishop Carroll was thrilled, Dubourg was filled. The donor, Samuel Sutherland Cooper, had the idea and was determined that it would be in Frederick County, Maryland, not in Baltimore. And he had that idea because there was a boys' school in central Frederick County, Maryland, what we know today as Mount St. Mary's. And he thought the women's school should be in that area for the convenience of families. So one thing led to another, and yes, in fact, Mother Seton and some candidates that joined her in Baltimore came to Emmitsburg, which is the furthermost western town, and that before you get to Gettysburg, it's right near Gettysburg. And they set up shop. They started St. Joseph's School. Women came to join them, and the community was growing. They got the rule from France for the Daughters of Charity. They adapted it, and the Sisters of Charity were established. Over time, that group grew into other branches. But Mother Seton herself established the school in Emmitsburg and an orphanage and school in Philadelphia, and an orphanage and school in New York. One comment that she has about American parents, I would just like to share with you because it speaks volume. Now, she wrote this in around 1811 or so. I'll tell you what I know about American parents to be most difficult in hearing the faults of their children. In 20 instances where you see the faults, they are not to be immediately corrected by the parents, but rather by good advices and education. So the bottom line is, she felt American parents were defensive about their darlings. And you know what? She may have been right. So Elizabeth had a lot of experience as wife and mother, and then being a widow and trying to manage, and then moving into this new aspect of her life, which only built on the roots of sanctity that she had established in the Protestant Episcopal tradition. As we look at her as a saint, she's a model and an intercessor. She's a spiritual leader, and she drew her strength from the Eucharist and from prayer, her union with Christ. Now, some of the characteristics of her spirituality that any of us could imitate. She appreciated nature and its beauty. She had a great respect for the fragility of life, human life and nature. She would be an ecologist today. She drank deeply from sacred scripture, and Psalm 23 was her favorite throughout her life. Her devotion to Mary continued to be ongoing, and I've mentioned the Memorare. She had a great trust in divine providence and Jesus as the Redeemer. These are terms that come out in her Protestant years also. She would have loved, maybe she wouldn't have loved it, but the renewal of Vatican II. She loved the liturgical celebrations. It was the ritual, the rich ritual, the incense, the candles, the atmosphere of Catholicism in Italy that just amazed her. The Eucharistic processions of carrying the monstrance around. Her sense of the real presence was both in the Eucharist, but in also serving Jesus and persons in need. Matthew 25. She saw Christ in others, particularly the most vulnerable, and she taught that to the students whom she had. So her concern for the neighbor from her New York days with the poor widows was a natural transition into her commitment as a Vincentian woman to educate children who were poor and to help poor families. I think she was pious. She was attracted to virtue. And in the tradition of Vincent de Paul and Louise de Marillac, it seems to me that she reflected gentleness, honesty, and compassion, or what you would call humility, simplicity, and charity, which Francis de Sales had said in advices to widows were the characteristic virtues of a widow, a Christian widow. Now, I see Elizabeth Seton, and I turn to her a lot as an intercessor, but I see her as a notable Vincentian woman. Now, you know that Vincent de Paul is the patron of the Diocese of Richmond, and I believe it's your bicentennial, so congratulations. Samuel Sutherland Cooper, who was the donor of the land, was a Virginian. He was a native of Portsmouth. And he, as the major benefactor, we wouldn't have come to be if it hadn't have been for him, I don't think. He told Mother Seton's successor, and another widow, Rose Landry White, that please make the people of Virginia priority for your missions and ministries. Help convert the heathens in Virginia. That's what he wanted. So Mother Rose sent Sisters of Charity to Virginia. And Sister Karine wanted me to be sure that I emphasized that the Mother Seton tradition and mission and charism was transplanted down there, first of all, in Richmond, at St. Joseph's Villa, what you know is, you've heard of as St. Joseph's Villa, St. Joseph's Asylum and School. We started a school for poor children in Alexandria. This is 1834. I mean, this is back a few years. And then in Norfolk, a school for children who were in needy families. We were even the nurses at the infirmary in Richmond. They called it the medical college. Today, I know it as MCV. And we didn't stay there long because the sister there, was a fine woman, but she said, you know, I don't think this is going to go anywhere. I don't think this is the right place for us. But it did go somewhere. We started what became to be known as St. Mary's School and Orphan Asylum in Norfolk. And a number of Sister Karine's relatives were involved with St. Mary's, both on the board and as students at St. Mary's School. The sisters ministered in the yellow fever epidemics and the smallpox epidemics down there, and began what you may know as DePaul Hospital, which was St. Vincent's Hospital in 1857. And then that incident between the North and the South happened. Some call it the War of Northern Aggression. But at the time of the Civil War, the Confederate medical officials asked for the sisters' assistance both in Richmond at St. Francis de Sales Infirmary and the General Hospital. And we were near you. We were out doing battlefield nursing at Manassas and several other places in that immediate area. As far as I know, we were not at Brandywine. Just looking at my notes here. We left Richmond for Manassas under the charge of a Dr. Williams, the medical director of the Army of the Potomac, and found 500 sick and wounded patients awaiting our arrival.
I have my meeting.
From Richmond, we went to Georgia, Alabama. We started a school in Portsmouth, Petersburg, Stanton, Lynchburg, and we did night duty at the United States Naval Hospital in Portsmouth during the Spanish-American War. The reputation of the sisters as a result of Civil War nursing did a tremendous amount to decrease the prejudice against Catholics, because we cared for any patient without discrimination, whether they were of the Northern Army, of the South, or whatever. So the gift that Mother Seton has been to the church, the United States, and her ministries in Virginia successively has really been a legacy of charity. And I would like to just conclude my part before I entertain questions with a favorite quote, because I think it's a way all of us can approach life as it comes, especially during challenging times. Quote, "Faith lifts the staggering soul on one side. Hope supports it on the other. And experience says it must be, and love says, let it be." Close quote. So may Mother Seton fill you with faith and the hope to support everyone else, and with your hearts of love, go forward, and we will weather this pandemic and challenging times together.